welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thanks for joining me. I release my content that is crime orientated on a Wednesday and a Sunday. So if you like crime, you like consistency, specific deep dive consistency, then this is the channel for you. Join me for a live chat. I'm usually there when I do my premieres on a Wednesday and a Sunday. It's great to get to know you. Kenny's Crime Cult is growing and you're a lovely bunch of people. Thank you very much. Thanks for your likes and comments and your subscriptions. Also, you can now join my membership if you want some extra perks, Discord, and also a live chat once a month. I will be there having a natter with you. And on top of that, my Patreon subs, thank you so much. You're the reason I can keep creating this content and you're the reason that it keeps improving. Lots of new podcasts coming there. I know that you've enjoyed my Undercover Police Officer one, which I'm going to be carrying on, and also my Making Sense of It with me and P, and other family members will be dropping in. So thanks to everyone for listening to my Patreon podcast and supporting me. The case I am going to cover today is one that you asked for. And the reason that I've chosen to do this is because it was very local to me. And every crime has infinite meaning. Every loss is an infinite loss. But sometimes when you know the area that it happens, particularly when you worked in that area, as I did, it feels really personal. And also, what surprised me about this particular murder is the fact that I didn't know the details of it anywhere near the level of what I've been able to discover. And it has really surprised me, and I'll talk about that as we go through this. I'm going to be covering the case of Tia Simone Rigg. Tia Rigg, who was murdered by her uncle, John Maden. Tia was born on the 4th of January 1998. She was born in Manchester, and her parents were Lynn Ahmed and Lee Rigg. So she was the fourth child in the family. So Lynn had 4 children, and then she would actually go on to have another 3. So she came from a sibling group essentially in the end of 7. Now, Lynn did have quite a lot of dysfunction, I will be honest. The children were born of 4 different fathers. I appreciate that many of us have children by multiple partners. That doesn't mean that we're an excellent parent, but it can mean that there is a level of displacement within the family, and the consistency clearly isn't going to be the same because of that. Now, her 3 eldest children had actually been removed from her care. They've been placed with other family members, and that instantly gives us an insight into potential dysfunction that's being experienced. It takes a lot on the whole for social services to remove children from parents. In fact, often when we cover cases on this channel, a lot of you will feel really angry that social services hadn't intervened at an earlier level because horrible things happen to certain children. So arguably, when we kind of look at it from that position, there has to be really good reason, and often quite severe reason, as to why a child is removed and placed elsewhere. It's great that her children were placed with other family members, because I would say that children fare better when they have a relationship with their mother, no matter how challenging the circumstances have been to them being placed elsewhere. It can still be really helpful for them to retain that relationship. The main reason for them being placed elsewhere was because of Lynn's history of substance abuse, and she had high-level substance abuse issues. So heroin and crack cocaine in the past had been something that she'd really struggled with. We all are aware that when you have a dependency that's serious, clearly your main relationship is with the drug of choice. And even though that doesn't make you a terrible person by any stretch at all, it just means that you don't tend to have the resources that are required to bring a child up in a safe environment. And it means that sometimes your attention is off the ball because you're worried about getting your next hit. So it makes sense that social services determined that it wasn't a safe place for children to be brought up with at that point. Also, Lynn had suffered from quite serious mental health problems, and really sadly, she'd attempted to take her life on numerous occasions, which is awful. It's really difficult to be an individual who's suffering with such serious mental health issues that you don't want to be here. And the fact that she'd repeatedly tried to take her life demonstrates that she obviously wasn't feeling that life was getting better. But in some of the ways that she did it, it was also quite abusive. to others because she did it in front of her children on occasion. That in itself is highly abusive behaviour. I appreciate that she was also a victim, but for children that would be terrifying to imagine that somebody that you love, your primary caregiver, albeit not the best, actually tries to kill themselves in front of you. That's debilitating psychologically, emotionally, socially, in every way, shape or form to go through. She also had quite a serious criminal record, so she'd been in trouble for things like robbery and assault. And robbery is a serious crime, it really is. So I often think when people think about robbery, they imagine that it's something like theft, but it's not. Robbery means that you're removing something from an individual using force. So we're introduced to also quite a violent side potentially of her nature. And she'd also experienced quite a lot of difficulties in her life, so repeated incidents of domestic abuse and domestic violence in her home. So she was a victim too. And as much as clearly I've gone through some of the rap sheet and the history behaviourally of Tia's mother, you know, with respect, that's a tiny fragment of who she was, and I appreciate there'll have been a whole human being behind that. But it's not an enviable position for children to be brought up in those kind of circumstances. So because of this very clear and understandable history that causes concern, Tia was actually placed on the Child Protection Register before she was even born. So social services wanted to keep an eye on how Tia being born and how she was being brought up would play out under the watchful eye of making sure that they would regularly check in and make sure that she was in a position to be taken off that register, or indeed to remain on it, or indeed to be removed from home. So the Child Protection Register is basically one where it identifies a child who is at risk of neglect, and that's what they imagine that she may be of. And this was actually later changed to being at risk of physical abuse. So they were concerned about potential physical abuse implications. Now, despite the fact that she was obviously on the authorities' radar as a child at potential risk, and also with respect, there were also various reports of domestic abuse in the home. There were reports of neglect during her life. And even though these were not isolated incidents, and she was on the Child Protection Register, so arguably you'd imagine that they would be taking extra vigilance around this, it does seem, through my research, that there was very little involvement as regards social services interaction with Tia during her life, which I found surprising if you think about how chaotic the family life has been, and also the red flags that I have described to you, and the fact that realistically other children haven't been able to safely remain at home. Well, we are in a position where we have to ask ourselves, so why wasn't somebody checking in very regularly? Tia grew up in Cheetham Hill. It's quite local to me, about 20 minutes away. And it is an area that has some social issues. So it's known to have a higher crime and drugs issue. But I will also note that when I spent time working in Cheetham Hill, it was a really close-knit community. There are lots of very, very good people who live there. But as I said, there is an undercurrent of, shall we say, less pro-social behaviour. Tia actually did leave her mum for a short period of time. She briefly went to her aunt's in 2008, and the reason for that is because she'd been made the subject of child protection plans. But nonetheless, she ends up getting returned to her mother's care in October of the same year. So it was a short duration. But again, it just gives us some insight, doesn't it, to the dysfunction that's occurring at home, that things aren't typical. They're falling outside of that, and maybe social services are starting to become a little bit concerned about what's playing out in Tia's home life. So despite this atypical childhood and this highly unstable stroke dysfunctional home environment, Tia was actually described as a really very happy girl. She was obviously deeply resilient, and as much as life wasn't necessarily perfect from an external perspective, she thrived, so to speak. She was a student at Albion High School, which is in Cheetham Hill. She was known as being full of energy. So she was described as having that bubbly personality. Also, she was very popular. She was an agreeable kind of girl. People liked her and warmed to her, and she didn't struggle to meet friends. She liked sports. She was particularly interested in things like swimming, trampolining, and netball. People described her as having an infectious, cheeky smile. And you'll see from the pictures that I put up that she had this really pretty, freckled face. She was also very compassionate, and people who were friends with her and also who knew her said that she loved animals, she loved children. So I guess one could say that she was one of those naturally inclined humans who looks at vulnerability and seeks to protect it, which says a lot about her character. And bear in mind, this is not a girl who's had the easiest start in life. This is a girl who, understandably, have faced some big struggles and big challenges, and yet here she is, being incredibly empathic and caring. Also, she stayed out of trouble. So she had this great close group of friends. She spent a lot of time with them, and she wasn't notable at school in any other way than positively. And I think that the reason I feel such a need to express that is because often what will happen is if you come from a particular area and you're born to particular parents, and when people think about you being on the child protection register, they will often make a lot of assumptions about the way that they expect you to behave. And it's not true. And Tia is a great example of how those kind of assumptions play out so incorrectly. She was a lovely young girl with everything to live for, and obviously with a school and friendship life that stood her in really good stead for future success. Also, like a lot of people in Manchester, she was a really big football fan. She supported Manchester United. Now I say Manchester, and I bring in Manchester United, but actually, pretty much anywhere you go in the world, people are like, Manchester United. If you come from Manchester, the assumption is you definitely know all the Manchester United players, and every single one of you is indeed a United fan, which is not true, because we have City as well, and there's quite a divide with respect. But also, Manchester United fans seem to be all over the UK. The only place I've ever been where I come across people consistently, like in Essex or in Devon, and you'll be like, who's your football team? And they'll be like, Manchester United. And you're like, that's weird. But nonetheless, she, rightfully so, was a Manchester United fan living in Manchester. And I mean, she was a real fan, by the way. You know, she watched all the matches. She was devoted in that way. Now, as I said, she had a dysfunctional family as far as the fact that children had been taken into care, and I noted that her older siblings were already placed with another family member. But as I said, she had another 3 children after Tia, so her mum ended up having 3 younger children at home when Tia was present. Again, what was Tia like to her siblings? Well, as I've just described, she was fantastic. She would help out in the home. She would help her mother. She was a really beautiful big sister to them. She looked out for them. There was no problem when her mum needed help looking after the children. She extended that help, and she upped that help as well after her mother and father split up. So she wasn't a resentful child. She wasn't a difficult child. She wasn't somebody who resented the fact that she was required within the home. Quite the contrary. Tia was somebody who was more than happy to help. And again, we're just introduced to this deeply compassionate nature, this pro-social young girl who's homing in on all these skills, such as helping out with the family children and being a great friend and doing well at school. All the foundations that are required, ideally, to create truly pro-social humans. And whenever I tell a story about a child who has been murdered, I'm not just thinking about the fact that the family has lost that child. Of course, there is nothing more debilitating, traumatizing, horrifying, or life-limiting as far as future happiness is concerned than losing a child. We will all agree to that. But it isn't just the family that loses that child. It is the potential and possibilities that our society has lost too. It's what Tia could have done for our world, in our community. It's what Tia could have taught her siblings. It's what Tia could have taught her friends. It's the ramifications and the impact that somebody like her can have in the world around her. So when somebody like this is murdered, we all lose in that way. By 2010, 12-year-old Tia at this point, she's living with her 34-year-old mum and her 3 younger siblings, and they're living in the grandparents' house. So that would arguably give a more sturdy support opportunity because of the fact that the grandparents are there too. Also, her uncle, 37-year-old John Maden, he lived very nearby. So he lived 100 yards from Tia's house on the Dudley Brew estate. One of the things that I would say about North Manchester, which is where Tia lived and where I live essentially, is it is not unusual whatsoever for us to live in a small radius of our family. I myself live minutes away from my brother, my sister, and my mum. It's just one of the things that is very common here. We like to be close to our nearest and dearest. And in areas such as where Tia lived, where there is a higher level of deprivation and poverty, families often stay very close together because it means they can help each other out. So there's a real community spirit as much as it comes from a place of hardship. Now, as I've noted, she lived near her uncle John Maden, just 100 yards away from his house. And he was divorced. He was also a father. So he was known to Tia as an individual who had a child of their own. John was Lynn's brother as well, so it was her mother's brother. But I will note that even though Lynn and John were brother and sister, they really didn't have a close relationship. And that's in spite of that very close proximity. I mean, you're literally living basically on the same street, but there isn't a very solid relationship there. However, none of you will be surprised to know that in spite of the fact that Lynn and John were not close, Tia was different. Bear in mind what an agreeable, compassionate, lovely young woman Tia is. And the fact that she's living with her grandparents and she has that link generationally with them, and that John Maden is living literally 100 yards away, she has this understanding of what family is and the roots that they provide, and she clearly likes having that closeness. So she grows close to her uncle. She has a really good relationship with him as well. She's been to his home on lots of occasions, and one of the reasons for that is they both have this massive passion for football. I'm going to be honest, guys, I have never got the understanding for the passion. I just don't get it. I wish I did. I try to act like I do when there's big games on, but I am a bit rubbish at that. But I do appreciate people are deeply passionate about football. It's like how I feel about things like cake, with respect. We all have passions for something. Some of us for people kicking a ball around a big garden, and some of us for just eating really tasty stuff. And I'm the latter, with respect. But this connects them both. They get on with each other because of it. They have obvious communication between them because of it, and they have a trust for one another because of it. On Saturday, the 3rd of April 2010, this is at 2:17 p.m, Maden calls Lynn and he says, look, is it possible if Tia comes over? I could really do with some help because my 10-year-old daughter's here and I would like her to come over and look after my 10-year-old daughter. Maden had basically separated from his wife the previous year. Tia, of course, straight away agrees. Of course she agrees. This is what Tia is like. She's happy to look after her cousin for him. She's done it on lots and lots of occasions, and essentially it would give her a chance to watch the football. Arguably, the age difference between Tia and her cousin, for me personally, does not feel big enough. I don't think a young girl should be looking after a 10-year-old girl. I don't think that it's something that she is equipped psychologically to do if there are any problems. And I don't think on a safety level it's appropriate for her to do that. I also appreciate that when people live in close proximity to one another, they feel like they have support available if anything goes wrong, and Tia is very adept at helping out with children. Certainly, it wouldn't cause any concern, would it? She's going to her uncles, who can be trusted, she's always there, she knows the family, and arguably, why then wouldn't she help? The fact that she has this connection with him over football as well, and feels that the fact that United are playing Chelsea that day means that she certainly would have felt like it was an opportunity to go and just chill and enjoy herself. And one of the things that is really shocking is that when I talk about this crime, bear in mind that Tia had actually been at this uncle's house the previous day because he'd basically got a new puppy. So this was a very safe place. When Tia's family allowed her to go to her uncle's, there was no reason to second guess motives at all. Usually in cases like this, guys, I am going to be able to unpick prior behaviour. I'm going to be able to bring into evidence, shall we say, compounding material that makes me go, wow, this was always waiting to happen. Usually I can bring in reinforcers for those beliefs, such as long as your arm criminal records. Today, what I'm going to bring in is shocking because I can't do any of that. Because the question we all ask ourselves is, could this have been prevented? Could there have been alarm bells that we could have all have seen? And if we had really picked up on those, would we ever have let this girl go round to this man's flat? And it's very difficult when I tell you this tale to actually notably recognise anything in the past that would have made me or you potentially have said, don't go, it's not safe. Arguably, we can bring in her age. She was a young girl, babysitting. That isn't responsible for the adult to acknowledge and allow that. But aside from that, and when I tell you the detail of this, I think you'll understand ultimately why I'm saying what I'm saying right now. So as I've noted, the day before she'd literally been round to see a puppy. She's probably also excited about going back to see that puppy. I mean, most kids would just be desperate to spend time around a new baby puppy. It's just the way that we are. We love them. So her family happily sent her off. Why would they imagine for 1 minute that she could come to any harm at all? They had absolutely no concerns about Maden at all. And according to his record, there were lots of reasons for that because he didn't have any previous convictions at all. He seemed like a really caring member of a very close-knit family. It was Lynn who'd had problems. It was Lynn who had the conviction record. Maden didn't have anything like that. He was a father. He attended lots of family gatherings at his mother's home where Tia lived. Genuinely, the people around him believed that Maden was a completely regular guy. When you look at him performing karaoke at a pub, for example, you just see him really enjoying himself. There is nothing that stands out about this man that makes you think that what I'm about to tell you could even play out in the worst realms of your nightmares. When that family sent Tia around to their trusting member of their family, to her uncle, the man who'd been around her hundreds and hundreds of times, little did they know that that'd be the last time that they would ever see Tia alive. Tia arrived at her uncle's house, his flat, at 3 p.m. And pretty much from the get-go, what happened, they just started to talk about football. That was kind of where their connection lay. But no one, and I genuinely believe that no one in Maden's circle could possibly have known that football was the furthest thing from his mind. Because unbeknown to literally anyone who knew him, Maden was not the man that they believed he was. Over the course of the previous year, he had basically developed, or at least activated, a deeply unhealthy, reprehensible obsession with violent pornography, and specifically it was child pornography. And I'm not talking about any child pornography. And bear in mind, if you haven't come across me before in these videos and this is your first time viewing me, you don't really know about my views on child pornography, but I really struggle with the sentences that people who get involved with child porn are often given, because I think they are really way too lenient. And I believe that child pornography makes you a child molester if you are viewing it at home and have never touched a child. You are culpable. You are a child molester. Equally, I appreciate that for some of you watching, you may think that paedophiles are all child molesters. They're not. There is a proportion of paedophiles who recognise their predilection to have a sexual unhealthy interest in children, and they know it is completely wrong and they never act on it. That's a paedophile. But when a paedophile touches a child or views child pornography, they are a child molester. And personally, I find them the most distasteful human beings that exist. There are very few people who meet the same bar in my mind as people who are child molesters. It's a bias I have. It's also why, in spite of the fact that I've worked in victimology for many years, it's one of the places that I avoid working in. I don't want to work with child molesters. It is a personal issue for me. I do not feel that I'd be useful for them, so to speak. And the fact that this man has only got into it as an adult, this can seem surprising. Of course it can, because why would you suddenly start viewing this kind of pornography? But you know, people have fantasies in their head for a very long time. So the fact that Maden hadn't knowingly, at least, acted on this as an adult prior to when he gets caught for what he just did to you, the reality is he probably harbored these desires from a very early age and just settled on playing them out in his mind. Or we're not aware potentially that he's abused children elsewhere. That may not have come out, but there is of course a potential that he was abusing kids and just not looking at porn. He just hadn't been caught for it. But certainly it seemed that he had started to get highly involved with something called hurt porn, or hurtcore, torture porn. Now, like I said, any kind of child porn is utterly despicable. It really is. There is no soft child porn, okay? And I think that the problem is when we start talking about hurtcore torture porn, we're almost minimizing what would be less than hurtcore torture porn. We're not, I'm not. It's just that there are grades of child pornography. And when we talk about hurtcore torture porn, it is the most depraved. It is the most violent, and it can also involve child death. And that's what this guy had got into, albeit it seemed to be within a 12-month period. He'd got heavily involved on the dark web, and he'd even managed to find snuff movies. Snuff movies are horrific per se. They involve the degradation, demise, torture and death of the individual who is basically being filmed. And the reason that they exist is because there are sick human beings who actually gain pleasure from watching that kind of thing play out. It's blindsiding to me. It really is. The idea that somebody can be sat behind a screen and they can actually enjoy knowing that what they're seeing is not just somebody acting and simulating pain, they're feeling it and living it, and then they're dying from it, and people pay that kind of money. And it's worth noting that the kind of money I'm talking about for some of these kind of movies, particularly the pay-per-view ones, we can talk about them running into tens of thousands of pounds. Because they're rare, of course they are, because only a tiny proportion of the population are that depraved and disturbed and disgusting, but it demonstrates the fact that there are people who genuinely get great pleasure from this. When the police found Maden's hard drive, it was full of images and videos of extreme child sexual abuse. He had more than 2,000 explicit images, and the reason I'm noting that figure is you have to realise that I'm talking about some of those being the extreme level 5 categories of child porn. They are the worst you can imagine. And most of you won't imagine it. Because most of you listening to me right now, you won't even have the capacity in your brain to imagine the kind of stuff that plays out in that extreme level 5 pornography. You won't have the mental capacity to go there. It's not in your conditioning. It would be impossible for you to leverage in your head an idea and concept about what that would be. That's how severe it is. Many of the images had actually been burned onto CDs. So this guy liked storing this stuff. And one of the investigators who looked at this case made a comment that in a 12-month period, Maden had actually managed to download virtually all of the most extreme child abuse images in existence on the dark web. Let that sink in. This guy had scoured the dark web, scoured it to find the most depraved and violent and extreme graphic pictures and videos, to the point where he'd pretty much got them all. When I've worked with police officers who work in child pornography and bring people to justice and literally have their psychological well-being ravaged, and I mean that, for all the bad rep that the police get, and we always call them into question and into order when they screw up. Look at what we've done with Wayne Couzens and how Cressida Dix actually resigned in the UK, so she was in charge of the police, and we lost a girl called Sarah Everard to a police officer called Wayne Couzens, and there's been a whole heap of investigation, rightly so. We call them into question when they let us down, right? But we often are unaware of these men and women sitting day in, day out, having to bear witness to these images. So they know how, shall we say, the mythical snuff movies and the mythical pictures actually exist. Because in child pornography communities, there will be particular titles of videos that are just beyond belief, beyond human understanding, that almost become so rare to find that they become myths. Well, this guy had them. That's how devoted he was to finding this extreme child abuse. And when they wanted his mobile phone, police were able to also recover folders that he had, rape and torture folders. They would be entitled things like snuff stories, and brutal rape. He was absolutely fixated. And this is all going on without any of Tia's family being aware. And she's walking in to that place with this man who is nigh obsessed with some of the most depraved material going on in his mind, where he's almost got a full-time job sourcing these images. This individual has been gearing himself up, hasn't he? And that's completely unaware, as far as her family, that this is happening, that he is actually an individual of such great potential and harm. Also, they found that 7 months earlier, and this again, it's really hard to say this stuff because I know that for some of you, you probably don't know what I know. I have had the privilege of working with so many people who've been horribly abused. And I've also had the privilege of working on cases where I've learnt lots about the level of depravity that exists in certain individuals and the access that they have to things that in our wildest dreams we wouldn't even imagine existed. But he'd actually managed to access a series of online guides. And those guides were about how you could torture and murder a child. They were literally resources to help people who were interested in that know how to do it. And he'd also, in parallel with downloading these horrific murder documents, researched how to drug someone, but drug them so that they didn't completely fall unconscious, which I know will have you all instantly having your minds go where mine went as well. He doesn't want Tia to be unconscious, does he? He wants her to be at least semi-consciously present when he does what he wants to do. And it feels like that whole reading and downloading and prepping, I would say, psychologically prepping for what he wants to actually do was all about practicing what he's going to play out. What he's going to play out with that innocent girl who trusts him implicitly and thinks of him as the uncle who she can talk about football with. I think when he invited Tia around that day, it was just all about reenacting the violent porn that he'd watched on the dark web. She was his practice ground. Listen, the exact details of what happened to Tia that Saturday afternoon is never going to actually be fully known unless Maden starts talking. He's never disclosed them even to this day. But there are things that we do know because of the forensics and the injuries that Tia experienced. So we do know that shortly after Tia arrived at Maden's home, he did manage to drug Tia, and he used olanzapine. For those of you who don't know what olanzapine is, unfortunately I do, and I have personal experience with my father as to what that drug is. It's a very, very strong antipsychotic medication, and it can be, it's not always, but it can, in certain circumstances, be helpful in addressing psychotic episodes. And Tia's uncle Maden had actually been dealing with some of these psychotic episodes, and they help to balance that so that you're not feeling hyper-suspicious or paranoid, you're not scared, you're not dealing with psychosis, which is horrible and debilitating. But obviously you have to need that medication to actually take it and it have effects as it's meant to have effect. You certainly wouldn't give olanzapine to somebody who was perfectly well, because it's going to have a completely different effect on them, and the effect it will have is the real sedative one. So basically by giving it to Tia, it's going to make her really, really drowsy at best, and it's going to make her semi-conscious at worst, or coming in and out of consciousness per se. But it would also be really confusing for Tia, because she would know that she didn't feel normal. We know that after he had successfully drugged Tia, he then takes her into his spare room, into the spare bedroom. He lies her on the floor, he takes her clothes off, and then he tied her hands behind her back using a shoelace. She was 12 years old. She was 12. So he takes her and he ties her up after stripping her, and then he just subjected her to the most brutal sexual assault and torture. It's unimaginable, and like I said, I can only tell you the bare bones of this, and that's enough anyway. But he won't tell us what he did. We don't know what he said to her. We don't know how scared she was. We can only assume these things. We don't know whether she cried for her mother. We don't know if she understood that she was going to have her life taken. We don't know any of those things because he's just decided to stay tight-lipped over it. But what we do know is he raped her brutally. He violated her using a sex toy, and he even used a broom handle. Men and women listening to this, young men and women listening to this, you will all recoil when I say that, and you know why. Because you don't have to have the widest knowledge of sexual encounters to know what a broom handle would do to a 12-year-old child. The pain that she would endure and the damage it would do is too horrifying to even imagine. He also stabbed her, and I mean multiple times. This is when he had raped her. He stabbed her in the stomach, and she was still alive. She was still alive through all that. She was 12. She was going to look after her 10-year-old cousin to help him out. And that's what he did to her. And if it wasn't enough that he carried out such depravity on that little girl's body. He then garroted her with a guitar string. She was 12. Trying to even conceive what my expectations of Maden would be in this moment is impossible to align with the way he was. Because I would imagine that after he's committed this brutal murder on a family member, on your niece, someone who loved you and who trusted you, who saw you as a connection because you supported the same football team, who believed that you had her best interests at heart, that you would, after you've carried out that depraved, reprehensible murder, suddenly kind of come back into a realm of reality and think, oh my God, what have I done? No, what have I carried out here? What am I facing? You'd expect him to be in some kind of blind panic, maybe even to cover up the crime, spend some time forensically organising the place to try to make it look like you hadn't harmed her, hide Tia's body. These are all things that you might imagine he would do. Or maybe he'd just like totally break down when he suddenly comes to his senses and thinks, what have I done to this poor child? But it was nothing like that. It was the exact opposite. In fact, the only other time I have heard people act in a way that is so outside the realms of expectation in these moments is Lewis Danes, who killed Breck Bednar. And when you hear him on his 999 call, it's very controlled. He's very stoic, and it's very much about letting them know what they need to come and do now he's got away with his fun, so to speak. And it's like this with Maden. The way that he reacts is so cool, calm and collected. So at 3:45 p.m, he calls 999 and he confesses to what he's done. The call handler who took that call later said that the chilling calmness when they spoke really stayed with them. And it was something that was so outside their normal experience. And there was actually a transcript of the call that was later made available to the court, and it goes like this. I'd like to report a murder. Operator asks where it happens. He says 8 Dalmain Close. He's asked for the area and he says, that's Cheetham Hill. He's then asked for his name and he replies, John Nigel Maden. And the operator says, well, what's happened there? And Maden says, my niece has been murdered by me. And the operator says, where has this happened? And Maden says, I've just finished killing her now. The operator says, why have you done that? Maden says, because I felt like it. He's then asked her name and replies, Tia Rigg, and wrongly gives her age as 11. The call at that point is briefly terminated, but then it's soon reconnected to the operator, asks for more details. And Maden says, I'm quite sure the officers that come to the house will be able to take all the details you need. And the operator says, how's it happened? And Maden says, I've used with a knife and strangulation, and that's it. Bye. He then hangs up, and I imagine the person who took that call found that very, very traumatizing, but not as traumatizing as for the officers who arrive at his property literally 2 minutes later. I mean, they immediately arrest Maden on suspicion of murder, but wow. One of the things that the officers said was he was so unnervingly calm. And he'd even dressed in his best suit. This is a man who fully knew that he was going to go away for this. This is a man who even wore his best suit to be taken to the station. This is not an individual who's suffering from some hugely mental declining state. This isn't a man who's done things out of his mind and is now realising that he's got to pay the consequences. This is somebody prepped, prepared and ready because he's lived out exactly what he wanted to live out. And that's what's really terrifying about this man. He knew the consequences were coming and they were worth it. That's how much he wanted to cause harm to a child. Even if it meant sacrificing his freedom and his future, it was worth it to meet his depraved, despicable needs. The police go ahead and search the flat because they've been informed that there is a body there. And it doesn't take them long to find Tia's body. It's a grisly sight that meets them. She's lying on her back. She's 12. Whenever I'm telling these stories, I just get overtaken sometimes by the person I'm talking about. She's 12. 12. And they find her lying on her back in a pool of blood. She's clearly dead. She's naked. He hasn't even covered up her body. She's just got her socks on. And her hands are still tied behind her back. The guitar string is still tightly wrapped around her neck. They see 2 bloodied knives. They see the sex toy. They're positioned around her body basically, and also a blood-stained broom handles lay nearby. When they managed to establish afterwards how long she'd been dead for at that point, she'd been dead basically for less than an hour. So when they looked at the time frame, it meant that the assault must have begun basically just after she arrived at the house. So she'd literally agreed to babysit for her uncle just an hour and a half before. And then she was found dead. So within that hour and a half, he'd got her there, carried out this heinous torture and killing, and then the police arrived because he'd confessed to them. Now obviously there's an alarm that's raised. This is a very close-knit community, and Tia's aunt and grandmother get to the scene. This is before Tia's been taken away, it's before it's closed off, and they actually get in the house, and it seems that they may well have seen this horrific sight inside. I mean, I cannot even begin to fathom the impact there would be on an individual who is running to the scene of a crime, hoping to protect whoever it is that they love who lives there, to walk in, to see that sight. That gorgeous 12-year-old little girl defiled and murdered in such a way. They came out of the property in tears, and one was actually physically sick. Tia's mum also arrived just a little bit after they did. The neighbours who saw her said that she was just absolutely hysterical. She was just collapsed on the pavement, rocking to and forth, and she was screaming, why? And I think that's absolutely the question that would have been in all of their minds. Why? Maden never stood out to them as a threat. Maden was a father of his own child. Maden had spent time with Tia regularly. They were close. Why? How? Why her? It won't surprise you to know that a few days after Tia was murdered, Lynn actually went missing. She actually left a note saying that she wished to be with Tia. And she'd also taken some items from Tia's bedroom and just disappeared. And people were convinced that she'd taken her own life. And I understand that. I think that for most of us listening to this brutal case, most of us would hazard a guess that if our child was murdered, the idea of ceasing our pain permanently would definitely cross our minds. I have respect and understanding for that feeling. They obviously look for her because they worry that she may not be coming home, and they search for her. They put out a launch search party for her, and it turns out that she is alive. She was found by officers at a friend's house, thank God for that. When the autopsy came back, it was just as brutal as you'd imagine. Tia suffered some really horrific internal injuries and blood loss. That was because she was violated with the sex toy and the broom handle. Bear in mind, this was non-consensual, of course. She would not in any way, shape or form be relaxed in those circumstances. That is going to cause trauma to a private area, but then add to that a hard broom handle in a soft tissue area, and you cannot imagine the kind of damage that would be done. Meanwhile, the autopsy said that the knife wound to her abdomen had caused significant damage to her internal organs and had caused extensive blood loss. However, it also found out that she was still alive, even though she'd gone through this horrific sexual torture and this brutal stabbing. She was still alive, and the way she actually died was strangulation. It was the guitar string that actually killed her. The authorities later said that the injuries inflicted on Tia literally mirrored, the details in the online murder guides that Maden had earlier downloaded. He had followed that script. Some sick pervert had written a manual of torturing and raping and garroting a little child, and he had downloaded it and made it his own. An eternity in hell is not enough for those human beings at all. It really isn't. Because if Maden has used this guide, then you can bet your bottom dollar that some other sicko out there has done exactly the same. And we are talking about Tia's uncle here. Can you imagine the pain, the horror, the confusion that poor little girl experienced in those final moments? And if it isn't horrific enough to have told you that, the thing that really chills me is that Maden planned this particularly. You know, it was designed to be as long and as drawn out as possible that he had Tia in that way. He knew that he wanted time with Tia, so he made her completely defenseless by drugging her and then tying her up and then taking time playing out this despicable, this utterly reprehensible, this diabolical plan. When he was arrested, obviously he was asked about why the hell he'd done this, and he said he was basically listening to a bad voice in his head. Claimed this voice had been controlling him, telling him what to do, but in spite of the fact that this voice has managed to tell him what to do and has been controlling him and basically meaning that he's, gone ahead with these horrendous actions, when it comes down to the police interview, he just says no comment to all the questions. So, a little bit of a convenient voice there, isn't it? A little bit of a convenient voice. When you're doing bad things, the convenient voice is telling you, it's not your fault, I'm the bad voice, do this. But when you're in a situation where you can take responsibility and accountability and seem to actually accept what you've done, you suddenly don't have the bad voice because the bad voice has disappeared, and now you're in the rational voice going, how do I get off this? No comment, no comment, no comment. Was that the bad voice telling you no comment? Pretty strategic if that was the case. Poor Tia's funeral took place at St James's Church in Salford. And that happened on the 28th of April 2010, and hundreds and hundreds of mourners all wore pink. It was Tia's favourite colour. It's why I am wearing this top today in memory of Tia, because she doesn't get to wear pink anymore, but we can be reminded of her in that. They carried her body as well in a pink casket. They released 12 pink balloons at her graveside, and that was to mark every single year of her short but incredibly loved life. Reverend Simon Cook said this: she was a happy girl, strong-willed and free-spirited, and a bubbly personality. She usually had a smile on her face, and, as we have heard, she brought her family and her friends great joy and happiness. Love It's the reason why so many of you have come here today. It's what we hold onto in our deepest and our darkest moments. Death seems always to take us by surprise, but especially when it comes to someone as young as Tia. Even as we remember and celebrate Tia today, we come with a huge sense of grief, loss and pain, and many unanswered questions. It's right to feel those things because Tia mattered to you. But behind that grief and that loss, that pain and that questioning is love. Love that lasts beyond this and beyond this death. And as I said, this case is close to home, and Reverend Simon Cook is somebody that I know very well. He's somebody whose church I went to every single week for many, many years. And whilst he isn't now the reverend of the church I attended, he still is in our local area working to help people who have great struggles. And it's amazing that Simon's words resonate so deeply with all of us. The fact that I know him and know the kind of person that he is and the kind of service that he would give Tia and her family brings me a great deal of comfort, because those words would have come from an incredibly heartfelt place. And like I said, I think that what he says is so true. It's what I talk about regularly with people per se. The pain of grief is love in disguise, and we must always remember that. Tia had infinite meaning no matter how her end played out. On the 13th of May 2011 at Manchester Crown Court, this is shortly before Maden's trial was due to commence, he decided to plead guilty to Tia's rape and murder, which was obvious because he'd literally confessed he'd done it on the phone. He had a body in situ at his home, and he had that much child porn that alone should have been able to send him to prison for life per se. Now, prosecutor Gordon Cole QC stated this: "It was murder purely for his sexual gratification. It had a sexual motive. The defendant had developed an obsessive interest in images and literature relating to paedophilia, rape and torture. He had an extensive library of such materials, which included literature dealing with methods of killing. This material and the subsequent discovery of Tia reveals the defendant was acting out a long-held fascination with rape, torture and abuse of children," which, as I said at the very beginning of starting to describe this case, we all agree that whilst he may have only activated the physicality of his predilections when it comes to Tia, although we don't know whether he abused other children, the reality is that he held those predilections deeply within himself, potentially his entire life, building to a point where he had, shall we say, prepped himself to a point where he needed to use that tipping point into action. And Tia, unfortunately, was the recipient of that harm. When the judge came to sentencing, obviously their job is to look at the mitigating and aggravating circumstances, and wow, were there serious aggravating factors in this case. First of all, Tia was a child. She was 12 years of age. Also, massive breach of trust. This was her uncle, who she should have been safe with, who carried out this crime. And also, her uncle used that trust so that he could solicit a victim, essentially. He knew that she would come, because why wouldn't she? That was somebody that she loved. He'd never made her feel unsafe in that way. So therefore, the fact that he procured her in that result means that he had this complete knowledge that she would come because of that trust level. That in itself, as far as I'm concerned, should mean he should never see the light of day. He just took advantage of her relationship with him in the worst imaginable way to simply satisfy his perverted desires, and also in spite of the ramifications that would have for the family, because Tia is one of his own. It's his sister's child. It's his parents' grandchild. So the ripple effect of grief is going to be astronomical. And I'm not for 1 minute saying it would have been better if he'd gone and murdered a stranger's child. Of course it wouldn't have been. What I'm saying is, it shows you how little care, compassion and consideration he has per se. It doesn't matter who he hurts, including Tia or the family that love her. The other aggravating factors included the fact that he drugged her, so it had been premeditated, and then he tortured her and he murdered her. This had all been meticulously planned, massively aggravating factors. And Judge Mr. Justice Keith, he referred to the fact that Tia's agony when he read the autopsy and the forensic evidence must have been prolonged. And he stated this: "It is inescapable that Tia Rigg died because you decided to realise your fantasies about torturing and killing a young child. The fact that you chose your 12-year-old niece, who had put her trust in you, made what you did all the more unspeakable." He also dismissed Maden's claim that he had bad voices that have been controlling him. Sorry, I know that sounds sarcastic, but having worked with people with mental illness who go through some of the most challenging times because they're dealing with things like schizophrenia or psychosis, these are horrible situations that they face, and they don't use it to take advantage of circumstances at all. And yet here Maden is trying his best to suggest that actually it wasn't him, it was the bad voice in his head that told him to do it. And again, it's deeply upsetting for people who genuinely struggle with these kind of concerns and issues, because it's how sometimes the media portray people as if people with mental illness are dangerous and might murder you, which is wholly untrue. So the judge, as opposed to believing that, this guy was suffering from psychosis and was listening to voices that were controlling him, the judge would have none of it. Said, this is simply you creating a defense mechanism that is completely aimed at you shifting the blame. And actually the judge said, I can tell, not only do you not have this excuse because of your apparent voices, you have been fully in control of what you've done. Because you have been seeking out violent porn, you've been seeking out manuals of how to kill a child and torture a child, you've had some real careful planning of what you wish to achieve, and you've manipulated Tia to a place and position where she is at your request, essentially. You can do what you want with her because you've got her into the home in a way that means that she's defenseless. That does not sound like you're struggling with a mental health issue. That sounds like you have coldly, calculatingly, and efficiently created a ruse and a perfect opportunity to carry out your violent, aggressive, reprehensible, disgusting molestation and murder of a child. So it didn't work in his favour at all that he was trying to suggest that his mental health was the issue. On the 4th of October 2010, the judge decided to do what I think was only right. He sentenced him to a full life term, and he should definitely serve that full life term. I'm sure that all of you are just relieved to hear that. Yeah, it's very, very rare that a judge will place somebody in prison for the rest of their natural life. But the judge said there were exceptional circumstances, that the exceptional nature of this crime meant that he would literally never be eligible for parole. That sentence made Maden the 40th inmate in British custody with no prospect of ever being released again. That's how rare they are. And that's how serious this crime was. The judge literally threw the book at him, and I feel very glad that the judge threw a book at him. I think sometimes there are certain individuals who we should be allowed to throw things at, just willy-nilly, like on visiting hours. Just visit this prisoner, they've been so bad, you can throw anything at them. I'm not talking rocks, I'm just talking general items, haberdashery maybe, but that's what it evokes in you, isn't it? That sense of how dare you do that to that child? How dare you take that life? Like I said at the very beginning of this, one of the things that really struck me was that Maden had never actually given anyone any cause for concern, and yet he was clearly capable of such abject brutality. Brutality in the most grotesque form, the most extreme way. Now, as I mentioned, as far as his family and friends were concerned, as far as the society around him was concerned, he didn't actually have a criminal record, but he actually did, it turns out. In fact, he had been in trouble for burglary and threatening behaviour, but because he had stopped offending like 20 years earlier, the earlier convictions had been struck off his record. So it meant that no one knew that he had actually had a history of criminal behaviour. That said, he had no history whatsoever of sex crimes. So that's very unusual that we see this complete escalation and amplification in such a short period of time. He'd only begun watching the violent pornography and child porn 12 months before the murder. Shocking, really, isn't it? To see how clearly he had a predilection for it. He was obviously interested and attracted to minors. That would undoubtedly be within his nature. But to see how he can go from having that predilection, that attraction, to starting to view child pornography, to then escalating to a point of no return, as we've seen, but such graphic depravity within 12 months. I know that when we talk about radicalisation, we're talking about terrorism and those kind of extreme views, but it almost feels like a child pornography radicalisation, that if you have that predilection, there is a possibility, if you have this innate, shall we say, quality about who you are, character-wise, and about what you find attractive sexually, that this kind of constant viewing, and the dark web now is just full to bursting with this kind of disgusting material, it is possible from someone to go from child molester because they're viewing pornography to child killer because they've ingested so much and given themselves a permission base to act out these fantasies. Also, it's worth noting, because this is just a horrific case to talk about, that I'm sure a lot of us feel frightened by the information and how these things can happen. But sexual homicide is actually very distinct. It's a very, very rare type of murder. So according to research, most sexual murders do involve male offenders, and they tend to make their first sexual homicide before the age of 30. Maden was unusual in that way. He was actually 37. So it is alarming how his first known instance of a sex crime was actually the torture and murder of a child, isn't it? Such a huge transition between who he apparently was to who he actually is. Research also tells us that sexual homicides typically involve close contact weapons. Now, that's possible because it allows for that more intimate and gratifying experience for the perpetrator. And that definitely seems to be the case with Maden, because he used knives and he used a ligature, so it was very intimate, wasn't it? And I will say there is something that had exacerbated stress in his life, because Maden seemed to have lost his job recently and his marriage had ended. So there had been definitely an exacerbation of stress, and there were concerns about his mental health that had occurred just after the marriage ending and him losing his job. And he had actually said that he was hearing a voice in his head, which is why he'd been prescribed the antidepressants and the antipsychotic medication olanzapine. That was, as I said, what he used to drug Tia. So was Maden genuinely mentally ill? And is that why he went ahead with the murder of Tia? I agree with the judge. No, I don't think he was. And when we look at some of his history online just before he killed Tia, the night before he went ahead and did it, he'd actually boasted to 2 students online that he was a writer with a particular interest in rape. It's completely untrue, of course. And he wasn't a writer per se. In fact, they only ever found a handful of scribbled notes at his home. So you could say, well, maybe that's evidence of him losing his grip on reality. But personally, I think it was just a way of him boasting and getting off on the way that those words would impact on those students he was talking to. I just think he was obsessed with rape and torture and killing, and any opportunity to talk about that or write about that would be something he found intoxicating and sexually satisfying. I don't believe he was mentally ill. I feel, although I can't validate this is true, but I am more on the side, shall we say, when I look at his behaviour, that he had a sociopathic mindset. The killing had evidently been sexually motivated, but there was also a deeply sadistic element to it. Maden wanted Tia to know what was happening to her. He wanted to know what he was doing to her. But he also wanted her to be unable to fight back. And that shows you just how aggressive, disassociated as well from the reality of the individual that he's harming he was. She was just an object to satisfy those depraved desires. She wasn't a little girl anymore. And the fact that he probably drugged her to a point where she was conscious but completely unable to fight back, the fact that he would have just had full control over her. She was 12. You know, when you think about sociopathic, psychopathic individuals, they want to dominate, they want to control, they're predators. And when you think about the domination, control, and sexual power that he had over Tia, certainly that was something he seemed to enjoy. He didn't just want to kill her. He wanted to torture her. He wanted to put through a psychologically, physically, and emotionally traumatizing, horrific event. And when you think about narcissism as well, and narcissistic personality, you kind of think, well, this guy just wanted to use Tia to satisfy his violent, perverted fantasies. He didn't care what happened to her. He didn't care what happened to him even. He didn't make any attempt to hide his crime. You know, once he'd had his fun, he literally left her naked with the ligature still around her neck, and he called the police. He called the police because, as I said, he got what he wanted. It wasn't about getting away with it. It was about getting to do it, living out the fantasy against all the odds, against all the costs. All that mattered to him was satisfying that dark nature. And when you think about how sadistic he was, well, sadists enjoy their victim suffering. They enjoy it. But once she was dead, well, she wasn't suffering anymore. The excitement was over for him, so he called the police. He knew he was going to have to deal with it. There was nothing left to get on with, to get out of it. So he called the police, got himself dressed in his best suit, and game over, bang to rights. But what a cost for that little girl. And the fact that he's never expressed any remorse disgusts me. He never even explained why he chose her. Why Tia? And I have to say, I think the reason is as simple as this. She was the one he had access to. She was available, she was vulnerable. Simple as that. Because he didn't care who he killed. He was going away. He was going to go to prison. So may as well select the easiest victim. The one who would walk off the street willingly into his home, blindly trusting this man that she believed loved her. That's the harshest part of this, isn't it? Tia died because she loved someone, and she believed he loved her too. He has left so many unanswered questions in this case. So many questions that her family want answering and will never get answered. Just leaving so much heartache for her family. And they're so undeserving of that. Research suggests that perpetrators of sexual homicides actually tend to be rational people. They understand the nature of their actions. They're rarely psychotic with respect. However, they tend to have personality disorders. And Maden must, in my opinion, be a prime example of how psychopathy and sexual sadism can work in conjunction with each other to result in a sexual homicide. Just to say as well, sexual sadism has been diagnosed as this. It's a paraphilia involving at least 6 months of recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies, sexual urges, or behaviours involving acts, real or simulated, in which the psychological or physical suffering, including humiliation of the victim, is sexually exciting to the person. So Maden's 12-month obsession and violent child pornography obsession and the manner of the way he killed Tia would definitely satisfy the definition I've just talked about there. Following Tia's death, an investigation was carried out into Child Protection Services that was looking at the involvement with Tia's family. The subsequent report that they launched identified basically a catalogue of serious failings. They said that there were 7 chances to help Tia earlier in her life and that all of those 7 opportunities had been missed. So social workers had failed to protect her from basically that initial stuff I talked about, the severe behavioural problems suffered by her mother. That was including the suicide attempts in front of the children, leaving them home alone, and that regular violence that was witnessed between family members. Social workers also failed to recognise just the general chaos of Tia's family life. But that said, even though they accepted that there were interventions that could have taken place, that certainly would have had a more positive impact on Tia's life while she was alive, when they explored how she died, they came to the conclusion that there was nothing that could have predicted the horrific actions of her uncle. And we get that, don't we? It doesn't mean that all of those other options that could have made her life better should have been afforded Tia. It's just that when a psychopathic child predator kills a child out of the blue, understandably, social services couldn't predict that that was ever going to happen. You won't be surprised as well to find out that Tia's mum actually received a lot of criticism in the press after Tia's death. This was particularly following her announcement that she was going to potentially sue Salford Council for its failings. At this point, there were loads of allegations because in the months before Tia's murder, Lean had been abusing drugs again. Her children had started to witness domestic violence again, and she basically wasn't cooperating with Child Protection Services. Obviously, Lynn definitely had her own personal issues, but to get all of that negativity thrown at you for your child's murder must be very painful because Lynn, like I said, was dysfunctional and she'd no doubt owned that. But she didn't want her child to be murdered, and she certainly didn't think that her child would be murdered by somebody that her child trusted. She loved her. She wasn't the one who killed her. And even if Tia had, let's say, been taken and placed in care with other family members like her older siblings had, well, Maden would still have had access to her. So we always want to blame somebody, I appreciate that, but the blame lies directly in Maden's place. That's it. And Tia's mother wasn't a great A-star parent. I'm sure that if she watched this, she would agree that. But she didn't deserve to have her child murdered. Nothing that she had done in the past could have ever prepared her for such an experience. And compassion needs to be projected there, not disdain. I can't imagine what it would be like to have lost a child in those circumstances and for the perpetrator to be your own brother. No, it's horrifying. After Tia's death, her mum said this: "When this nightmare happened, it killed me inside. My heart's been broken, it will never mend. All that's left is a big, empty hole. Tia was my whole world. I miss a big smile every morning and a beautiful freckly face. She always laughed when I said that. Not a day goes by when I don't think of her. I love her and miss her so much and always will." I wanted to end the video on those words. I'm the first person to hold my hands up in judgment when I believe people need to be judged, and I appreciate that Tia's mother deserves some judgment for some of her failures, certainly the domestic abuse and letting her children witness it, the suicide attempts and letting her children witness it, but she is not guilty of why Tia is dead. And what we know about Tia is, in spite of an imperfect life, she was happy and healthy, surrounded by friends, loved by many. So she wasn't a child who was in a terrible state when she met her fate. She is wholly, wholly unlucky that the monster in the midst of her family was never spotted. And I hope that Tia's extended family still feel that in spite of the fact that they will never get the peace that they deserve because of Tia's loss, that at least they got justice in Maden going to prison forever. Forever, Maden. Forever. God, I hope you have a long life. I hope you have a long life and are deeply unpopular amongst your prison peers. That's the only thing that gives us some comfort in this moment. Thanks for suggesting I cover this one. Like I said, it's close to home. It's one of those that even I, with the stomach I have, struggled at moments imagining what this poor child went through. Hopefully we've done this particular story justice. Hopefully we'll all remember Tia with her freckly face and a gorgeous smile and the meaning that she had in this world, albeit that it wasn't long enough. Like I said, it's us, it's society, it's communities that lost out and beautiful souls like Tia's get snuffed out early. Also, just to represent the fact that every single day in all of our neighbourhoods, these sick individuals sit behind their screens, ingesting despicable content, abusing our children from afar. And as a society, my God, do we need to do more to prevent those perverts getting away with what they get away with today. Because Tia is a victim of that world, albeit an extreme victim. If you'd like to get involved on my Discord, membership's up, please get involved in chat. Let me know what you've thought about this. As I've said, Patreon's up. I love getting my podcast out there. There's going to be loads and loads of different ones coming out on Patreon. But to the majority of you who are here right now, just want to say, those of you who can't support me in those ways, you support me massively every single time that you come here and you write a comment, you give me a like, you get involved in the chat. I adore you. You're legends, a lot of you. And this is for Tia. Take care.